All right. Welcome everyone to the Reading League Florida's monthly webinar. I am Jesse Stife and I'm the president of the chapter. Just a few short words before we get into the content of tonight's excellent webinar. I want to encourage everyone to keep up with us by either visiting us at fl.thereadingleague.org or following us on Facebook at the Reading League Florida. While you're on our pages, I encourage everyone to consider joining us as members. Your membership helps us keep the lights on and keep the high quality PD coming. We are an all volunteer 501c3 organization, so this is only a labor of love and every penny goes right back into the organization. So I encourage you to keep on the lookout for our October webinar, which should be advertised soon on social media and on the website. But for tonight's webinar, we've opened up the Q&A function and we welcome our live participants to ask questions during the presentation. Dr. Farquharson will be taking some questions at the end. All right, and lastly, it's my honor to introduce Dr. Kelly Farquharson. Dr. Farquharson is a speech language pathologist and an associate professor at Florida State University. She is an affiliated faculty member with the Florida Center for Reading Research, and we have the honor of having her on the board of directors for the Reading League Florida. She directs the Children's Literacy and Speech Sound Lab, which has a mission to help children with speech and language impairments achieve classroom success. And she's published more than 30 peer-reviewed articles related to the subject of tonight's presentation. And she's frequently invited to present across the country on topics related to language and literacy. So Dr. Farquharson, thank you so much for being here, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jesse, so much for the invitation and also just for your leadership on our chapter of the Reading League. Thank you everyone for attending today, or if you're watching this recorded later, thank you for taking the time to think with me this afternoon on what dyslexia looks like in the classroom. So as Jesse said, my name is Kelly Farquharson. I am an associate professor at Florida State. I use she, her pronouns, and I'll tell you a little bit about my research lab here as we kind of go into our afternoon of thinking about what dyslexia looks like in the classroom. So at Florida State, I run the Children's Literacy and Speech Sound or CLASS Lab, and we are fairly active on social media, with Instagram being our most active account of ClassLab_FSU. So these are just additional ways, if the content that we discuss today is interesting and you want to hear more, learn more, chat more, these are other ways to get in contact with us and to hear about additional publications and presentations from members of our lab. So as Jesse said, I'm a speech language pathologist, and so I approach this topic of dyslexia from several lenses. One, I worked in the public schools as a speech and language pathologist in Pennsylvania, and so I think about my experience working with those children and then the overlaps that I saw with children who have dyslexia and co-occurring speech and language impairments. And so I'll talk to you a little bit about those today, but I really wanted to think about the different kinds of things we see in the classroom for kids with dyslexia. So I really took the title of today's webinar seriously, and I'm going to walk through some explicit examples of what it looks like in the classroom for children who have dyslexia. So in order to do that, we have to kind of first set up what dyslexia is and talk a little bit about the process of reading and what it means to have a hard time reading. And so as Jesse mentioned also, we don't have a chat function on this webinar tonight, but I do have the Q&A open. So the next thing that we're going to kind of launch into is somewhat interactive, but I'm not going to be able to see your responses. So I'm going to ask you to kind of turn and talk to a neighbor or write down on a piece of paper your responses as you're kind of thinking through these examples. So I'm going to ask you in this hypothetical scenario to consider between this grandfather and this grandson, who is actually doing the reading. So in this scenario, we've got a grandfather who was educated up until about sixth grade. And he was raised during a time that education wasn't really cherished very much, and it wasn't really a priority for his family for him to go through the education process. But he has this grandson, and he, at one point in time, the grandfather stumbles across this old text that his mother used to read to him when he was a young boy. And he was really excited to see this text that he hadn't seen in a while. And he knew that the stories in there were going to bring back some nostalgic memories for him. And so he gave it to his grandson and asked his grandson to read him a story from this book. Well, the grandson is, kind of looking at the book, and he says, I can't read this. I don't know what these words are. I can't read this. And so the grandfather says, just look at the words on the page and just sound it out. Just try to sound out the words on the page and see what you can do. And so the grandson is looking at the book, and he's trying to sound out the words on the page. And the grandfather is hearing this grandson and hearing his attempts at decoding, and he's hearing this story. And now he is flooded with those nostalgic memories that he thought he might be. And he's thinking about his mother, thinking about his childhood, and just really reflecting on this experience of finding a book from his childhood and hearing these stories that he thought were kind of lost forever. So in that example, who is actually doing the reading? So as I said, I won't see your responses, but who is actually reading here? So if you think it's the grandson, if you think it's the grandfather, if you think maybe I'm pulling a fast one on you and it's neither or both. So if you said both, you're on the right track, but I would argue that it's neither, because neither of these individuals are actually engaging in the process of reading. The grandson is looking at the text on the page and attempting to sound it out, but he's not understanding the story or the words behind the print. And the grandfather isn't able to engage with the print, but he hears the story and understands it and can probably retell it or answer some questions about it. And so neither one of these individuals are actually engaged in the process of reading. And so this is an example that shows the simple view of reading, which is a theoretical framework that's commonly used in the science of reading literature and some of the research we do in my lab. And so the simple view of reading tells us that word recognition multiplied by language comprehension results in reading comprehension. And so in order to actually be engaged in the process of reading comprehension, there are a lot of skills at play. And so word recognition is what the grandson was doing. He's looking at the text and recognizing the words and decoding them, but he's not following the story. And the grandfather was hearing the story and understanding it. So he's engaged in language comprehension, but he wasn't recognizing the words on the page. And so neither one of these individuals have the full picture of what it takes to engage in the process of reading comprehension. So word recognition, we're talking about the ability to translate printed text into pronounceable words, and language comprehension as the ability to understand text if it's heard instead of read. And both of those combined result in reading comprehension, which is the ability to understand text. And I think what's really important about this particular depiction of the simple view of reading and of the process of reading comprehension is this multiplication sign here. Because what this is showing us is not that this is an additive relationship, that we take word reading and then we add comprehension and now we're in the process of reading comprehension. It really is multiplicative. It's reciprocal in nature and it's multiplicative, and it improves and increases exponentially over time. So as we learn to decode more words, we have the ability to understand more text as we hear it. And so this grows over time. And so really then when we think about reading comprehension by itself, reading comprehension is a skill that's really hard to measure. It also then means that our reading comprehension scores are pretty loaded, and we don't know a lot about a child's ability just from a reading comprehension score. So if their reading comprehension score is low, it could be because they're the grandson in that scenario and they don't understand the they can decode the text, but they can't tell you anything about the story. And that probably triggers some memories for you of kids in your classroom, either this year or in years past, that you read a story and then you say, who was the main character in the story? And they have nothing to offer. You ask them to maybe sequence aspects of the story, or to recall pieces of the story, to predict things, to make some inferences, and they're not able to participate at that level. So that's kind of where the grandson was. The grandfather, by contrast, if you read that story to him, he'd be able to answer all of your questions about who was the main character, what happened in this story, why, maybe some predictive questions he'd be good at, but he wouldn't be able to read that story on his own. So when we look just at reading comprehension scores, we're really not getting a picture of what's happening. We have to look at the details of how their word recognition scores are and how their language comprehension scores are in order to really understand their reading comprehension abilities. So this theoretical framework of the simple view of reading is well validated. There's over 1,000 scientific articles that have validated this framework over time, and our use of this framework for assessing and treating reading impairments such as dyslexia. And so we can call this body of literature, in combination with some other decades worth of literature on reading, we call that the science of reading. So it's really a body of literature, scientific literature, that has contributed to our knowledge of how children learn to read. And so a lot of what I'll be talking about tonight is couched within the science of reading, and that includes the simple view of reading, which is really going to drive how we think about assessing and treating dyslexia. So we're calling it the simple view of reading. Is it really that simple? And of course, if I'm asking that question, the answer is probably no, right? So this is one of my favorite depictions of the simple view of reading. This is called the reading rope, and this was developed by Hollis Scarborough in 2001. This is a really popular graphic, and you may have seen it in different formats. I like this one in particular because of the color coding. But if you even just Googled the reading rope, you would find dozens of iterations of this, but they were all developed by Hollis Scarborough. And so what I want to draw your attention to is, at the very far right side of our screen here, we see this tightly woven and beautifully multicolored rope that is representing the skilled and fluent execution of reading. And so this is where we expect children to be by about third or fourth grade, that skilled and fluent execution of reading, that they can do both what the grandson was doing in that very first example and what the grandfather was doing. They can silently read a passage to themselves and answer questions about it because they have this combination of skills. And so what you'll see then is the kind of reddish colored thread of the rope is representing our word recognition component of the simple view of reading, and the bluish strand is our language comprehension component of the simple view of reading. And then within each one of those components, there are lots of little skills, and not little as in they are easy to develop and easy to remediate if they're impaired, but just little in terms of that they work together. There's a lot of them that work together to support this larger construct. And so for language comprehension, we have things like vocabulary knowledge and verbal reasoning. For word recognition, we have things like phonological awareness and spelling. So we'll talk more about the word recognition side of things tonight. So we will spend some time digging into phonological awareness and some examples of that. We'll come back to this image a time or two as well. But we're also going to use the simple view of reading to help us understand the individual differences that we see in poor readers. So not all children who are poor readers are the same. And so the simple view of reading can be helpful for determining our assessment and our treatment, because we do want all of those things to be in alignment with each other. We want to identify in the classroom how a child is experiencing reading, and if they're not doing well, what kinds of assessments or curriculum-based measures have been used to determine that they have a hard time with reading. And then based on that, we're going to use an assessment procedure that is going to help us get more information about their reading ability. And then from there, we're going to use the data from our assessment to inform our treatment plan for that child. And so it should all be in alignment with one another. So we'll use the simple view of reading today to help us understand this. So this is kind of a matrix to help us understand our poor reader subgroups. And just to kind of orient you to what you're looking at here, we do have the simple view of reading components of word recognition across the top with poor word recognition and good word recognition. And then along the left side, we have language comprehension and also poor or good within the language comprehension component of the simple view of reading. So we're going to fill in each one of these boxes with the definitions that we use to understand these poor reader subgroups. So we're going to start in the top left corner where we've got poor word recognition and good listening comprehension. And so this is an example of dyslexia. So we've got poor word recognition and good listening comprehension. And I will go into a lot more detail about what dyslexia is given the purpose of tonight's webinar. But this is our first kind of fairly simplistic view of what dyslexia is. When we think about the simple view of reading, these are children who do poorly on the word recognition skills necessary for reading, but do well for the listening comprehension or language comprehension skills necessary for reading. And then we've got kind of the exact opposite of that, where we've got kids who have good word recognition, but poor language comprehension. And those are very cleverly labeled as poor comprehenders. And then we've got this box here, our bottom left quadrant. We've got children who are poor at word recognition and poor at language comprehension. And these are children who are who have some sort of a mixed reading disorder because they, under the simple view of reading, experience difficulties with both of these constructs. And then in our last box, of course, these are our typical readers who are good at word recognition and good at language comprehension. So we're going to spend the remainder of this afternoon talking about dyslexia and going into a lot more detail about this particular subgroup of poor readers. So what exactly is dyslexia? It is a language-based word reading deficit. So as we know, based on the simple view of reading, these are children who have poor word reading skills, but good language comprehension skills. So this is a language-based word reading deficit. It is neurobiological in nature, which means that you are born with dyslexia. So if you have dyslexia, you've always had dyslexia. You were born with it, and it is also then not going to go away because it is typically something that is experienced for life. It is present at birth and is experienced for life. It does exist along a spectrum of severity, just like any other disability, disorder, difference that we see. I think autism often kind of takes the spotlight on the word spectrum, but a lot of the disabilities and disorder categories that we see and work with in special education exist along a spectrum of severity. Dyslexia is no different. So it can really exist along a wide spectrum of severity levels. And it is the most common learning disability. So that may seem surprising to you because it's not often talked about in schools, which we'll dig into the law behind that as well. But it is the most common documented learning disability. So we characterize dyslexia by difficulty with word reading or spelling. And importantly, we know that dyslexia is responsive to systematic treatment. So although we're not really going to get into a lot of the nitty-gritty details behind interventions today, just given our time of 90 minutes together, we will talk a little bit about it. And hopefully by the end, you'll have a better sense of what kinds of interventions would make sense for a child who has this language-based word reading deficit. Dyslexia is often unexpected because in relation to a child's other cognitive abilities, they tend to do well in other areas. So they may show strengths in things like math or science or art. They may have real strengths in other areas, and it's not a cognitive disability. So it can sometimes be surprising because we think, well, this child is really bright in these other areas. And that's actually a hallmark of dyslexia, is that we are not expecting to see a diagnosis like that. It's kind of surprising that they can't read words when they do so well with some other skills and strategies and areas, educationally and otherwise. And it's also sometimes unexpected because sometimes we see that kids get really effective classroom instruction, but they still have dyslexia. So it's possible for someone to have dyslexia, have a wonderful experience in the classroom as far as effective classroom instruction, but that's not going to make dyslexia go away because it's a neurobiological disorder. So I know we have kind of a mixed audience tonight as far as some speech language pathologists, some classroom teachers, and possibly some in between, maybe some parents as well. But I did just want to kind of give a nod to our classroom teachers to let you know that you can be an excellent teacher and still have children with dyslexia in your classroom. Children having dyslexia in your classroom is not a reflection on your teaching ability or your teaching style or your engagement with the curricula in any way. This is a neurobiological disorder that this child was born with. And yes, you do have a responsibility as the classroom teacher to make sure that that child gets the support that they need. So we're going to talk about some of the red flags you should be looking for from kindergarten through 12th grade. But you need to hear that you can be an excellent teacher and still have children with dyslexia in your classroom. In fact, you are, and you do, because 1 in 5 school-age children have dyslexia. So there is no doubt in my mind that right now there is at least one child in your classroom who has dyslexia, if not 5 children in your classroom who have dyslexia. And so this is a reality. And so we need to have a better understanding of what this is so we can help these children find the support that they need. And also so that we can empower you as educators to make sure that you have the skills to help them in the classroom and to help them identify the help that they might need outside of the classroom. So just as important as it is to identify what dyslexia is, we do also have to address what dyslexia is not. So dyslexia is not characterized or diagnosed by seeing letters backwards. That is not a hallmark of dyslexia. It never has been. And so this is a large myth surrounding what dyslexia is. This is not a characterization of dyslexia. So people who have dyslexia do not see letters backwards. We don't need to wait until 3rd grade to diagnose dyslexia. So I'm going to show you today some red flags that you can identify as early as preschool that may end up being predictive of a child's dyslexia diagnosis. Of course, we want to, make sure we're monitoring them and screening them appropriately before we make the diagnosis for sure, but we do not need to wait until 3rd grade. That is waiting to fail. And so we want to make sure that our preschool, kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade teachers are prepared to identify and highlight possible red flags for dyslexia much, much earlier. Dyslexia is not a visual problem, so it has nothing to do with how we see letters or how we process text. And therefore, or process text visually, I should say. Therefore, it is not responsive to colored lenses or eye tracking exercises. It's not going to be responsive to colored overlays on paper. There's no such thing as a dyslexia font, despite the very popular BuzzFeed article. That is not a reputable source, sadly, and the dyslexia font is not a reality. So these are the things that we know dyslexia is not, which is unfortunately just as important to talk about as it is to talk about what dyslexia is. So now that you've heard this message, I'll just ask you to take a moment and take a page out of Maya Angelou's book. And once you know better, do better. And so going forward, making sure that we're kind of part of this Mythbusters team together to make sure that the people in our lives, the people in our communities, the parents that we work with know that this is not a characterization of dyslexia, that someone does not see letters backwards. And that's not what that means. So dyslexia is a language-based word reading deficit, which I've said a few times now, but what is language? What are we referring to here? So I'm going to explain language through this 5-domain process that is really common if you are a speech language pathologist. This is kind of a requirement to even get into any of our secret societies to be able to label all 5 of these. But if you're a classroom teacher, this particular breakdown of language may not be as familiar. So we've got phonology, morphology, semantics, syntax, and pragmatics. And so for each of these, just a quick definition: phonology, we're referring to the sounds in the language. Morphology is referring to small parts of language that carry meaning, like our past tense ed that's applied to certain verbs. Semantics is referring to vocabulary or word meaning. Syntax is referring to sentence structure, and pragmatics is referring to the social use of language. And so phonology for dyslexia is the main area that is affected. I say main area because, as I'll kind of talk about here, there can be some overlaps, and I'll be explicit about what I mean by that. But phonology is the main area of language that is impaired with dyslexia. It's the impairment in phonology that creates a situation that makes it difficult to read words. So phonology, again, is the understanding of the sounds in language. And so this is the main area of my research is phonology. I consider myself a phonologist as far as my study of language goes. And so I study speech sounds. So my lab name is the Children's Literacy and Speech Sound Lab. So we study speech sounds as it relates to literacy. And so that's why dyslexia is one of the populations that we study, but it is not the only population that we study. So I'll talk a little bit more about a couple other of groups of children with communication impairments that we like to examine in our studies. So as a reminder too, this area of impairment can be along a spectrum of severity. So, this can be impaired to a variety of degrees. So you can have someone who has a mild phonological impairment and someone who has a really severe phonological impairment. It can really vary. So in a different kind of language disorder, which I'll talk just a little bit about today, is developmental language disorder, or DLD. In children who have DLD, by contrast to dyslexia, which is really kind of specifically a phonological impairment, for children who have DLD, any one of these 5 areas can be impacted, again, to any varying degree, but it could be any combination of these 5. So it can be an impairment across all 5 of these areas, or any combination of these 5 areas. And so that is a disorder that I wanted to make sure I talked about today, because it is a very prevalent disorder. Developmental language disorder, or DLD, is 5 times more prevalent than autism. Yet it is not quite as widely known among educators. And so I definitely wanted to make sure that I at least brought it to your attention, talked about it a little bit. This is a great resource, DLD and Me, this website here. It is created by some of the most well-known and world-renowned scientists for children's language disorders in the world. And this website was built as a parent resource. So it really is really friendly language. It's a really well-constructed site. There's lots of videos, lots of great information, and they've got some social media accounts that you could follow too if you wanted to learn a little bit more about DLD. So I mentioned phonology being the area of language that I mostly study in my lab. So this does often include children with DLD because although it's not, their difficulties aren't exclusively reserved for the phonological system, it can certainly include that as a combination of areas of difficulty. But another population that I'm really interested in are children who have speech sound disorders. And this is a population of children who have difficulty producing speech sounds. And so this is certainly the phonological area, the area of language that is related to the sounds of language, is certainly an area of difficulty for this group of children. They have a hard time producing the sounds of language. And so that's another group of kids that we study, sometimes in combination with dyslexia. So what we see with children who have dyslexia is that even though I said that this is a phonological impairment and that it is primarily an issue with accessing the phonological system of language, it is possible for a child with dyslexia to have difficulties in other areas of language, even if they don't have an overlapping diagnosis of DLD. So I'll talk a little bit about that overlapping diagnosis in a minute here, but it's possible for a child to have difficulties with other aspects of language as a result of perhaps the severity of their phonological impairment. So if we're saying that phonology is the sound structure of language and how we think about and understand the sounds in language, then that has implications for how a child learns morphology. So the example that I gave for morphology, these small meaningful units of language where you've got a plural S at the end of a word that changes dog to dogs or cat to cats, or a third person singular S that changes her to hers. And we have past tense ED was an example, so changing walk to walked. Sometimes those additional morphemes that could be prefixes, affixes, those are comprised of phonemes. And so if you have a really severe phonological impairment as a result of your dyslexia, it's a possibility that that has implications and downstream effects for how you understand and use morphology as well. And then the same can be said for semantics also. So how we understand the difference between the words pat and bat has everything to do with the phonemes that begin those words. So p, that voiceless phoneme at the beginning of pat versus b, that voiced phoneme at the beginning of bat. So learning the semantic difference between those two words also relies heavily on my ability to tell the difference between those two words. And so it's a possibility that you can have dyslexia and it's this phonological impairment, but that other aspects of language can be affected as a result. But just to keep things spicy, dyslexia can also co-occur with speech and language impairments. So dyslexia by itself can affect other areas of language, but it can also co-occur with the two speech and language impairments that I mentioned, developmental language disorder and speech sound disorder. So for developmental language disorder, DLD, we know that about 51% of those children who also have dyslexia. So there's a really high co-occurrence of these disorders. And luckily, we do know a pretty strong predictor of that within a population of children who have DLD is kindergarten letter identification. So measuring letter identification in kindergarten, if you're taking notes for your assessment battery or your curriculum-based measures, highlight, underline, put in caps that kindergarten letter identification is the best predictor of dyslexia in second graders who ended up with a diagnosis of DLD. So if we're looking to identify who falls within this 51% of children with DLD who also have dyslexia, we're going to want to look at their letter identification in kindergarten and then keep an eye on them. So as you can imagine, this is poor letter identification in kindergarten. So if they have a hard time learning letter names and sounds in kindergarten or earlier, that is a big red flag for us. We'll talk more about that as we go kind of through the different grades. But this is a really strong predictor, and it's probably something you're already doing. And if not, it's a really easy thing to add. As far as our kids with speech sound disorders, this was a study that we had published last year where we looked at a sample of kids who were already receiving services for speech therapy in the schools. So these were kids with speech sound disorders, and we wanted to figure out how many of them also had dyslexia. In our sample, we had 25% of our sample of kids with speech sound disorders who were receiving services already from their SLP. They already had dyslexia, and they were not necessarily receiving services for that dyslexia. But the important part of why I have it in italics, that these were kids who were receiving school-based speech therapy, is that this number of 25%, I think, is actually a pretty gross underestimate. And that's because there are a lot of children who have speech sound disorders who do not receive services in the schools due to misinterpretation of the laws and eligibility criteria that's not actually in alignment with IDEA. So as a result, some of these kids aren't getting services, so we're not able to measure whether or not they also have co-occurring dyslexia. So this was a sample of kids that were clinically identified. They were receiving services. They had an IEP goal to work on speech sound production, and a quarter of them also had dyslexia. That in a lot of them was also not receiving services. So this overlap or reciprocal relationship between reading and language is a really important one to understand. So in order to develop reading skills, you have to have strong language skills. So all of those language skills across those 5 domains that I mentioned, having a good phonological system, understanding the morphological structure of language, knowing semantics and being able to describe and explain vocabulary, understanding sentence structure, and then understanding the social use of language is all necessary in order to eventually become a good reader. Those are all prerequisite skills for becoming a good reader. And so then this relationship turns reciprocal because we continue to build our language skills through reading. So it's through the process of reading new books and reading curriculum-based text, reading graphic novels, reading comic books, reading chapter books, reading all kinds of books that open up avenues for more complex language. So it's through reading that we continue to expand and acquire language. We see new and complex syntactical structures. We see new vocabulary that we might have to look up. In fact, my husband and I always say that one of the things we love about reading on our Kindles is that you can kind of, if you have a Kindle, you can press on a word you don't know and the definition pops up. And that is just like the best thing, because that has helped expand our vocabulary so much. And we are, well, older. So, this is something that continues to grow and change and improve as you grow and change and improve. And so it's through the process of reading that you continue to acquire language. And so the same thing goes for other skills like phonological awareness. So that is necessary. Phonological awareness is necessary in order to improve word reading ability, but then word reading ability strengthens phonological awareness, and that then strengthens your word reading. So it's this kind of reciprocal relationship that just continues as we improve and grow and learn more. And this is a never-ending process, which is really beautiful. So as I mentioned, we have phonology is the main area of language that is affected for children who have dyslexia. But it is certainly a possibility that if they do not get services in time, that more and more issues with language can arise or can occur. Because if children, so we just talked about the reciprocal relationship between reading and language. So if children they start out with a strong underlying language system, but now they're not reading because they can't, because of their phonological disorder, that is dyslexia. And so because they can't read, they can't decode text, they're in the position of the grandfather in our initial example there, they're not able to decode the text. So then they're not getting that exposure to new and complex syntactical structures. They're not able to look up vocabulary words because they're not even looking at complex vocabulary. They're not reading at their grade level. They're not engaging with the same kind of print and the same kind of materials as their peers are. And so we might start with this issue within phonology, but it can grow into a much bigger language issue because they don't get the exposure that they need to be successful. They don't get a chance to experience that reciprocal relationship. And so then we turn back to our core reader subgroups. So in the same way that phonological issue can turn into a whole language issue, what we see then, or 5 domain of language, I don't want to say whole language, a 5 domain of language issue, we can also see the same thing happen with their diagnosis, that can turn their diagnosis from having dyslexia only to having a mixed reading disorder. And so what happens then, instead of being someone who is poor at word recognition, but good at listening comprehension, now, because over time you have not experienced that reciprocal relationship between reading and language that helps your language grow, which helps your reading grow, which helps your language grow. Now you might have a language comprehension issue later in your educational experience. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. This can tend to happen around 4th grade, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, really depends on the severity. But if you've seen kids who had been doing so well in school up until this point, we kind of refer to this as the 4th grade slump. That's what's happening, is that they aren't actually engaging in the process of reading in a way that's helping improve their language. And so then their comprehension skills don't develop in the way that they need to. And so their disorder can actually change from having dyslexia by itself to having a mixed reading disorder, because now comprehension is also impaired. Okay, so I am going to get into a little bit more detail here about what phonological awareness is. I'm going to turn us back to our reading rope. So as you saw, this is a more complex depiction of the simple view of reading. And so even though it is more complex than the simple view, it is really a nice depiction. And it really is, I also think, realistic of this many skills that are required to be a good reader. And so we are going to spend some time talking explicitly about phonological awareness, but I want you to keep two things in mind. One is that even though we know phonological awareness is one of these threads that is required to be a successful reader, it is only one thread. There are a lot of other skills here that are also necessary. So we're going to focus on the importance of phonological awareness, but this is not the only skill that's necessary. There are a lot of skills here that are necessary to be a good reader. And so the second thing then is to just keep in mind that over time, if we don't see improvements in phonological awareness, we may start to see some issues with the language comprehension skills as well. So just keep in mind that even though it looks like these are two separate constructs, they are multiplicative in nature, remember? And so they do rely on one another for development over time. So phonological awareness, I'm sure almost everybody here, if not everybody here, knows what this is, but just to get us all on the same page, we're talking about your sensitivity to the sound structure of a word. And we often measure this through tasks like rhyming, blending, or deletion. And so what I mean by that are a rhyming task would be, tell me a word that rhymes with cat, and the child might say mat or hat. In a blending task, I might give the child the phonemes of the word and ask them to blend those phonemes together to tell me what the word is. So k, a, t, and they have to blend that together to tell me cat. Or deletion, where I would say the word cat and then say, tell me cat without k. And so I would delete that sound from the word. And this can happen at the phoneme level, like I just showed you, but also can happen at the word level, at the syllable level. So we can kind of manipulate different aspects of language complexity within phonological awareness. And we know that research supports a causal link between phonological awareness and early reading. So our early kindergarten kids, preschool kids who have good phonological awareness tend to end up as good readers. Children who have poor phonological awareness in kindergarten tend to end up as poor readers. And so this is one of our red flags early on of looking at children's phonological awareness abilities. So an important thing about phonological awareness is that it exists along a spectrum. It is not one set of skills or is not one skill in isolation. It's really a compendium of skills. So we've got this spectrum or continuum of skills. I'm using the words easier and harder here. What I'm referring to is linguistic level. So I'm not saying that the skills or the activities I'm going to show you towards the easier side of things are actually easier for kids. I mean, in some cases they can be, but they won't always be. That won't always be the case, particularly if they have dyslexia, because we're asking them to use their phonological system, which is their area of impairment. And so this is easier and harder linguistically. So we've got skills like rhyming, so identifying words that sound the same at the end. Sentence segmentation, so telling me how many words are in a sentence or recognizing those boundaries of words. Syllable segmentation and blending, identification of initial phonemes, initial or final phonemes, and manipulation of individual phonemes. And so these last two blocks, these are definitely harder linguistically because both of these are phonemic awareness. So phonological awareness and phonemic awareness are not synonymous. Those are not the same thing. Phonemic awareness falls under the phonological awareness umbrella. So phonological awareness is kind of all of these skills, really kind of broad category. But phonemic awareness is really explicitly used to refer to the manipulation of individual phonemes. So we're not manipulating syllables, which is a larger chunk of linguistic information. We're not manipulating sentences or words, which are larger chunks of linguistic information. We're manipulating individual phonemes within a word. So we're saying dog, and we're segmenting that into d, a, g. And so we're manipulating those individual phonemes, and that is phonemic awareness. And this is important because phonemic awareness is really what's predictive of children's outcomes. And so it's their ability to manipulate the individual sounds of language. that is predictive of their later reading success. And so if you're measuring phonological awareness and really only looking at rhyming or maybe syllable segmentation, you're not getting as specific as you need to really see how their phonological system is performing. And so phonemic awareness. So I think of phonological awareness and phonological awareness skills. I call them eyes closed tasks. And so what I mean by that is, as I gave you a few of these examples of cat, k, at, I'm not showing you any print or any letters. I'm really just asking you to think about the sounds in that word and blend it together. So I think of phonological awareness tasks as eyes shut tasks. We're not looking at the print. We're not referring to the print. We're just asking you to think about, hear the sounds and manipulate them, kind of play around with them. And then by contrast, whenever we do have the print and we maybe have little tiles or blocks that we're manipulating, or a worksheet that's asking us to match rhyming words, that is phonics. And so these three skills, phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, and phonics, are really, really similar, but there's these little nuances that we need to be mindful of that make them quite different, actually. So phonics, I think of as eyes open tasks because we're referring to the print. So we're saying, instead of k, at, we might say C-A-T, and what happens if I move this C and replace it with an M? Now I have at. And so I'm still associating the sounds with the letters, but I'm showing you and talking about the letters, right? So we're making that connection, that letter sound correspondence. For some kids, that makes it a little bit easier because they have a visual to tie it to. For some kids, that makes it a little bit harder because their phonological system and their orthographic system might be really impaired due to having dyslexia or maybe some other co-occurring impairments. So it's just important to be mindful of what your task is actually asking children to do, because you might be facilitating good performance, you might be inhibiting good performance just based on whether or not print is there to help you. So we don't have our chat open, as I mentioned, but I'm going to ask you to play along to test your own segmentation skills. And so for the purpose of this activity, you do have the print here. And that's just to keep us all moving at the same pace and working on the same activity. But I am going to ask you to just think about the sounds in these words. So you're going to ignore the letters. You're ignoring the spelling, the orthography, the print. So you're ignoring the letter patterns here and the spelling patterns, and you're only thinking about the sounds in these words. And so you're going to segment the words into their phonemes and then reverse the order of those phonemes. And for each of these 9 words, you'll get a new real word. So I'll do the first one with you. I'll actually end up doing all of them with you because you're not in the chat. So the first word is teach. And so if we're going to segment teach, we get t, e, ch, and then we reverse those, ch, e, t, and we get the word cheat. Okay. So what happens when we reverse the sounds in sigh? We get ice. S, I, s. So if you said eyes, you're hearing that Z sound instead of that S sound at the beginning. How about cuts? We get stuck. Speak. Keeps. Jab. Badge. Seen becomes niece. Might becomes time. Tax. K, s, k, t. So we get scat, because that grapheme of X makes 2 sounds, k and s. And then caught becomes talk. So would you do this activity with the kids in your class? Probably not, but I think it's a really nice depiction of how hard it can be. I'm giving you these examples kind of consistently of cat and dog, and those are going to be really easy for you to think about segmenting, blending, rhyming, and this challenges your phonological system a little bit, hopefully. If it did, and if it's to the point where you need me to back up and repeat them all because you're really kind of struggling to think about that feeling, think about how frustrating that is. And that is a teensy tiny fraction of a 1% of a fraction of how children with dyslexia might feel in the classroom. Okay, so what should you be looking for in your classroom for these children who are incredibly frustrated by our consistent and persistent reminders to just sound it out when they don't have a good system for doing that? So what should you be looking for? I need to give major props to my friend Joy, who was helpful in creating some content here for what we should be looking for across different classroom levels. And some of these slides were also presented by me and Jesse and a team of our colleagues for the Florida Department of Education Just Read Florida webinar in the spring of this year. So I'm thankful for the time we got to work together on putting this content together. So I'm not going to read every single one of these slides because I do have several of them, but I want to talk through a few of these things with you. So if you are a preschool teacher or you're working with preschoolers in some way, there are a lot of things to be mindful of at this stage, because this is a huge and important stage to be identifying kids who are at risk for dyslexia. Preschool is ideally the time that we identify this population of kids. So if you have kids in your classroom, in your preschool classroom, who have had a particular hard time learning letter names and letter sounds, so they don't really understand the alphabet or don't consistently remember it, despite you maybe singing the alphabet song every single day. They have a hard time remembering things like numbers, colors, days of the week, how to spell their own name. This is a huge red flag. If you are a preschool teacher and you're seeing these kids, this is a huge red flag for dyslexia. As you can see here, it's not the only thing we want to be mindful of what you might see in the classroom for preschoolers, but it is certainly the one. If I had to tell you one to look out for, this would be the one. And I would say that would be particularly true if there are kids in your preschool classroom who have also had some delayed speech. So if their speech is difficult to understand, or they also have a speech sound disorder that's been diagnosed, that paired with the difficulty learning letter names and sounds, I mean, their phonological system is kind of screaming at you like, I'm not working the way that I should be, right? And so this is our huge red flag. Preschool teachers have a huge responsibility and opportunity to identify these kids really early. Then we have kindergarten and first grade warning signs. So some of these are going to be similar to what we see in preschool. At this stage, you might see that you're working a little bit more on phonological and phonemic awareness activities. And if you have children in your classroom who are really struggling with that, they're having a hard time with rhyming, you say, tell me a word that rhymes with cat, and they say mouse. So they're kind of thinking in a different way about how words go together. They're not thinking about letters and sounds. They're not thinking about sounds. They're thinking more kind of concretely about how words might go together with something else. That could be a red flag or a warning sign. These are the kids who have a hard time recognizing high frequency words. So you might call them sight words, but there's really nothing particularly beneficial about seeing those words. I'd argue that sight words don't actually exist, and that this is actually high frequency words that we're talking about. These are just words you see a lot, and that's why they're called sight words, because you see them a lot. So if you have kids who are having a hard time recognizing those high frequency words, that can be a red flag. You may also start to see some anxiety, frustration, lots of asking to go to the nurse, going home, stomach aches, headaches, because kids are smart, kids are intuitive, and kids know when other kids in the classroom are understanding things, they're following directions, they're completing their homework or table assignments independently. Kids are aware when they are different from their peers. And so if they're not working at the same pace or working in the same way, this can really create a lot of anxiety, and it can show up as early as kindergarten, sometimes even earlier. We'll talk about some of the downstream effects of that and how detrimental that can be to survival if someone is really experiencing this over a long period of time. And then we have second and third grade. So in these grades, you'll see some really kind of slow reading, labored decoding in isolation and in context, inaccurate decoding in isolation and in context. real difficulty with spelling. And that may or may not be also in combination with handwriting, that they may need some help from an occupational therapist, perhaps, for handwriting, but really hard time with spelling, omitting small function words, so articles, prepositions, copulas, auxiliary verbs. Those are all, those small tiny words that can really be omitted and overlooked by kids with dyslexia. They may kind of be monotone in their reading, so there's not a lot of expression. You can tell they're kind of guessing how to read based on the picture or the context or the beginning letter. So if they see, one of my favorite examples was a video I saw some time ago of a child who was reading a book about a dragon. And so the picture looked like a dragon. But the child said dinosaur when they saw the word. So, dinosaur and dragon can kind of look alike, and both of the words start with the letter D. And so they read the wrong word. And so this can really be a warning sign. At this point, you should have kind of a laundry list of things that have, they maybe had some delayed speech, some difficulty learning letters and sounds. Now by third grade, they're having some major difficulty with phonological awareness and confusing voiced and unvoiced sounds like D and T. So having a hard time differentiating between the two of those. So what happens at this stage then, we're going to tap back into our simple view of reading, is around that age. So we get a child who's 2, about the point of second or third grade, and our curriculum shifts. So when we think about the simple view of reading, we see a shift in our curriculum from learning how to read, right? So this focus on word recognition and spelling your name, writing your letters, learning your letter names and sounds, phonological awareness, writing a sentence. So there's a heavy, heavy focus in those early grades on word recognition. But then later we see this switch to language comprehension. So this happens in some curricula. It's going to vary pretty widely, but in some curricula, this switch happens between third grade and fourth grade, that we see the switch from learning to read to reading to learn. And so the focus of the curriculum becomes on language comprehension. So what happens to our little buddies who are back here in the word recognition phase and they don't know their letter names or sounds? They can't rhyme. They don't have phonological awareness. They are left in the dust. And so they continue to struggle. And that gap widens exponentially at this point, because we kind of stop teaching word recognition skills. And the focus is on read this to yourself and answer some questions about it, right? And we ask them to read chapter books, to read chapters in a book, and to do that independently. And so if they're not accessing the text, there's no comprehension that's possible. So one thing we can do at this stage is to have some audiobooks available. So to have that as an accommodation, it can be someone who reads to the child. That could be you or a parent, but it absolutely can be an audiobook, because it at least gives them that exposure to the language that they need, that they're not going to get independently because of their dyslexia. So what we also see at this time is our kids who have dyslexia in those early grades and had showed us all of those red flags, and we maybe did or did not intervene, we can see this shift in diagnosis show up around fourth grade as well. So they start to experience some difficulty with comprehension that they never really had before. And so we're kind of wondering as an educational team, like what happened here? They never had issues with comprehension in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, maybe even third grade. Of course not. We weren't really asking them to use their comprehension skills at that time. We were asking them to use their word recognition skills pretty heavily. Now they have to use those word recognition skills that they never got, by the way, to use now and build comprehension skills. So it might start to morph into or look like a mixed reading disorder, because now language is also impaired. And so between that transition, then what happens in fourth through sixth grades? So we see this continued difficulty. Now we're really heavy focus on oral reading fluency. They're going to be really slow. They will not be fluent. They're still probably going to be pretty monotone. They're going to have a difficult time decoding novel or nonsense words. Spelling is still a hard time, including those high frequency words. So fourth, fifth, and sixth graders who are spelling the, their, house, you incorrectly with transpositions and other issues. Within the same written assignment, you might see the same word spelled several different ways. And then just imagine then what this feels like, how exhausting this would be to now be a sixth grader and to have gone 7 years of education, maybe 8 if you had a preschool experience, of not having this skill, not having this ability, not being identified, not being offered help and support. And at this point, it's just exhausting to engage in the curriculum at all. And so that's super frustrating. Your self-esteem starts to really erode if it hasn't really started that process already. And so this is really a time where we start to see some behaviors happen. Some kids start to act out. In fact, there's some research that shows that fifth graders who were poor readers in the 3rd grade, by the time they were in 5th grade, they were more likely to consider themselves angry, distractible, sad, lonely, and unpopular, compared to their same 5th grade peers who in 3rd grade were good readers. So this 3rd grade reading achievement level is really important for making sure that not only can they read, access the curriculum, grow their language, expand their comprehension skills, it's their survival. It is their mental health. It is their social emotional well-being, and it starts really early. In our older grades, 7th through 12th grade, we see slow readers. Again, we see some issues with omitting or substituting some of those small words or articles and conjunctions, or maybe even overlooking parts of longer words. So omitting some of those morphemes, which can, totally change the word represent to misrepresent. It means something different in the context of a sentence when you say misrepresent versus represent. They avoid reading out loud, and not just because they're a teenager. They are going to have reduced background vocabulary and knowledge just because they haven't had exposure to print and stories and language over time. They have poor grades. They have a hard time learning foreign languages. They are in major danger of dropping out of school. And that's particularly true for kids who are retained. So there is really no research to support that retaining a child in a grade, repeating a grade, is beneficial. In fact, all of the research that I'm aware of, that I'm familiar with, suggests that it has detrimental long-term effects, repeating a grade. And so you can have dyslexia, get support, and not need to repeat a grade. This is incredibly important because, as horrifying as this is, and as hard as this is to talk about, children with dyslexia are at a higher risk for suicidal ideations. So I'm going to leave that with you and not expand too much, but this is a big deal. There are lives to save here. This is a matter of life and death. For adults who have dyslexia, we often see that they are slow readers. They may dislike or avoid reading. They take a long time to finish one book. Reading makes them very tired. They kind of are disorganized in their written expression. They continue to have difficulties with spelling. There's some word retrieval issues that we see. And adults also, just like our teenage friends, will have a hard time learning a second language or understanding someone who has a different dialect or an accent. They have a real hard time understanding those different phonological forms. So these are kinds of some of the things we see in adults. And it is absolutely possible to become a reader. It is absolutely possible to be an adult who can read if you have dyslexia. So we have to intervene really early when we start to see these warning signs at any stage. I'll say preschool is probably the most important stage, and preschool and kindergarten, are among the most important stages, because we can get in before any of this mental health and social emotional distress is in the way of a child's ability and interest in going to school, coming to school, learning. But it's never too late at any of these stages. If we start to suspect, we have a responsibility to make sure that they get the help that they need. And in fact, that is what is legally required of us as educators. So I'm not going to go into a lot of details here. I promise this is not the snooze fest piece of the presentation today, but I am going to just show you this little snippet from IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So this snippet in particular is from a guidance letter from the Office of Special Education and Rehab Services, OSERS. And this link is in your handout, which I don't think I talked about handouts, so I'll talk about in a second. The part that's underlined in red, I want to read to you. So the the impetus for this was schools saying that they can't say that a child has dyslexia in an IEP and then not providing appropriate services because they're like, we can't say dyslexia, we can't identify dyslexia in schools, we're not going to include that in the IEP. The language of the law says otherwise, and the language of the law is what's driving the IEPs, the decision making, the funding for schools. There's nothing in the law, so there's nothing in the IDEA or our implementing regulations that prohibit the inclusion of the condition that is the basis for the child's disability determination in the child's IEP. What does that mean? That means you can say dyslexia in a school. You can say dyslexia in an IEP. And so one of the groups that I've worked closely with is Decoding Dyslexia. It's a parent-run grassroots effort to increase advocacy and awareness about dyslexia. I've worked with Decoding Dyslexia in Massachusetts, where I lived prior to living in Florida, and now I work with the Decoding Dyslexia group here in Florida. Their hashtag is Say Dyslexia, and that's because legally you are allowed and required to say dyslexia in schools. And so there's nothing wrong with saying and using this terminology. What does your individual state say? Now that is a different question, and I'm going to give you the tools to answer it on your own. So my favorite website is improvingliteracy.org for answering this kind of question. Their state of dyslexia map is really great. So I'm going to walk you through a few examples of this from the improvingliteracy.org. So what they've done is they've gone through every state's legislation. If they have legislation on dyslexia, they have a map that's color coded that you can kind of toggle on and off to see what kind of legislation they have that supports dyslexia. So you should click on this link or go to this link and find your state and see what your state says about dyslexia. It will be broken down into what's required within the legislation. So is screening required, pre-service teacher training, in-service teacher training, and intervention. So there's several different categories, and I'm going to show you just the country as a whole, and then talk about just a few specific states and some issues. So in this map, what you're seeing is that all the states that are blue have one or more laws that discusses dyslexia. So someone needs to talk to Idaho. I will take the responsibility of going to Hawaii and talking to them. Okay, so you guys take Idaho and I'll take Hawaii, and we'll go talk to them about this. In this map, the lighter blue states require dyslexia screening. So the darker blue states have some sort of dyslexia legislation, but they don't require screening. So a lot of states, thankfully now, are requiring screening in schools for dyslexia. In this map, the ice blue states are requiring dyslexia intervention. So I'm going to toggle back and forth really quickly between the slide I just showed you and this slide here. So we've got the slot, pick one state that you don't live in and see if it requires dyslexia screening. Okay, so I'm going to pick Wyoming. And then when I toggle to this slide, does that state also require dyslexia intervention? And hopefully the answer is yes, because if we're screening for dyslexia and we find who is at risk for it or who has it, we should also be required to intervene by law. But depending on what state you picked, you might find that that was not true. And then this was the last map I'm going to show you. The light blue states here require in-service training for teachers. So I'm going to kind of do that same thing of toggling back, pick a state that you don't live in and follow it through. So I'm going to toggle back to the states that require dyslexia intervention. This time I'm picking North Dakota, which I'm going to for the first time in March. So I'll cross off a new state. So dyslexia intervention is required in North Dakota. And when I flip to this one, in-service training for teachers is not required. So we are required to provide dyslexia intervention, but we're not going to tell anybody how to do it, right? So there are a lot of issues with these state laws. I'm going to pick on two of the states that I've lived in that have kind of they also, if you click on the state itself on that interactive map, if you click on the state, you'll see the summary. So I'm picking on Nebraska and Massachusetts, two states that I've lived in. My issue with the implementation of their state laws is that they have a screening requirement. So Nebraska has a screening requirement and an intervention requirement, but we're never going to train any teachers on how to do this. So pre-service teachers who are still in school, who have not had a classroom of their own yet, we're not going to teach you what to do, but you're going to be required to screen it and do something about it, but we're not going to tell you what. And in-service teachers, the same is true. So that's incredibly frustrating. Massachusetts, I was part of a legislative effort to try to improve the legislation in Massachusetts. We did get dyslexia legislation on the books. I testified at a hearing at the State House. We did get screening on the books, but we're still not required to tell teachers how to actually implement that screening or do anything about that. So in my humble opinion, laws without opportunities to empower teachers with the necessary knowledge and skills to enact change for students with dyslexia are essentially meaningless. You put those laws in place and you don't help teachers enact that change, there is really no meaning behind those laws then. So let's dig into some information about screening and assessment. So a screening has only two outcomes. When we do a screening, we say further testing is needed at this time, or no further testing is needed at this time. And so that really important piece of this statement here is at this time, because passing a screening for now does not mean that you pass it forever. We have to continually screen kids. There should be at least annual screenings, if not 2 or 3 times a year. Kids are screened for dyslexia, because passing right now does not mean you pass forever. We see with that shift in learning to read to reading to learn, we can see how dyslexia can morph into a bigger issue. So screening at this time is only giving us that moment in time information. We need to make sure that we're following up. Here are a few examples of screeners that are available. David Kilpatrick came up with the PAST, which is the phonological awareness screening test. This is freely available. So if you go to this website or just Google everything that's here, Kilpatrick PAST, you'll find it, and it's free. It's a great screener. It's easy, it's quick. It has lots of different phonological awareness and phonemic awareness activities. Nadine Gobb is a researcher in Boston, and she does incredible work and incredible research in the area of dyslexia. Her lab, the Gobb lab, she has a screening for reading impairments document. So when you go to her website, you will see this image that's here, early literacy screening tools. And when you click on learn more, you'll eventually get to a Google Doc that is just a huge and robust Google sheet, Excel spreadsheet that has tons of different screeners on there. And they're really explicit on some caveats of, these are not necessarily all approved screeners, but they are screeners that are available. When I was planning for this, Jessie was really helpful in me thinking through how to prioritize our time together. And given the title of my talk, I wanted to make sure that you knew what dyslexia looked like in your classroom, what dyslexia was theoretically and clinically and educationally, and then what it looks like and how it can change over time. So I don't really have time as a result to get into the details of our assessment and intervention processes, but I'm open to a follow-up presentation to this, or a 2.0. And if you're open to that too, please do let the Reading League of Florida know. So if I were to recommend some constructs that I'd want to assess for a child who has dyslexia or suspected dyslexia, this is my menu of options that I'd want to look at. So I have the construct that I want to look at, so non-word reading or real word reading, and then I have some recommended assessments. Not all of them are required, and this is not exhaustive in any stretch. This is just the test that I would use or have used to measure these constructs in kids. I do want to talk a little bit about intervention before we open up for some questions. So intervention for dyslexia must be code-based. If dyslexia is a phonological processing disorder, we have to work on phonological processing. So if we're working on activities that are more related to the language comprehension strands of the reading rope, we are not going to be improving the underlying cause of dyslexia. So think about that reading rope. We have to be working on skills that are related to word recognition. We have to be working on decoding and spelling words. We have to be working on phonological awareness. And if we're working on other activities and other strategies, we're not going to be working on the underlying cause of dyslexia. So how do you know if something is code-based? Some language to look for. You want to look for a structured literacy approach. So I'll tell you what that means and give you some examples, but you want to look for a structured literacy program. Language to avoid, if you want to help a child or children with dyslexia, avoid balanced literacy, avoid whole language. Those are not code-based. They are not going to help children with dyslexia. By contrast, structured literacy will help children with dyslexia. This is the application of the science of reading. So the science of reading includes the simple view of reading and is this huge and decade-long body of literature that helps us understand what dyslexia is and how children learn how to read. Structured literacy is the application, the intervention associated with that body of science. So this is the most effective approach for students who experience difficulty learning to read and spell printed words. This is beneficial for all kids. So all kids benefit and learn from a structured literacy approach. But for kids with dyslexia, this is absolutely crucial to their success. A few principles of structured literacy is that it's explicit, that it's systematic and cumulative, and that it's diagnostic. So it's explicit in that it is intentional, there's direct teaching, and it's multimodal. It's systematic and cumulative in that the organization of materials follows a logical order. And it's diagnostic in that the teacher must be able to individualize the instruction based on continual progress monitoring and assessment of the child's response to that intervention. There are some possible certifications you could explore if you're interested in learning more about structured literacy. The Center for Effective Reading Instruction has an option. There is a great document through the International Dyslexia Association, Knowledge and Practice Standards for Teachers of Reading, and then Reading Rockets has some great resources as well. Importantly here, if you are in a school district that has purchased an evidence-based program that is said to help improve reading or is said to improve reading for kids with dyslexia explicitly, if they haven't trained you how to use it, then it is no longer evidence-based. So one important piece of these programs is that the teachers are trained in how to use the programs. Buying the program does not result in teacher knowledge, right? So if there are any school administrators here, buying the program does not result in teacher knowledge. Teacher training is absolutely imperative to retaining the evidence-based aspects of the program. So if you are in a school that is, or a school district that's really big on the terms evidence-based, science-based, you lose that label if you don't train your teachers. The teachers have to be trained in how to use the program in order for it to be evidence-based. So some conclusions. Dyslexia is a language-based word reading impairment. It's phonological in nature. There are children with dyslexia in your classroom or on your caseload, but you are still a good teacher or clinician. This has nothing to do with your ability to teach or ability to guide them through any sort of set of skills. They have dyslexia because of a neurobiological brain difference, right? And so you're still a good teacher. But early intervention is imperative. So seeing the warning signs, talking about the warning signs, and referring, asking for help, seeking out help is absolutely imperative at any stage, but at earlier is better. And our advocacy efforts really should be focusing on empowering teachers with the knowledge and skills to help children with dyslexia. So if you are a member of a state association in any way, or your Just Read Florida chapter, your Decoding Dyslexia chapter, if you're a speech language pathologist, your Speech and Hearing Association for your state, your advocacy efforts towards dyslexia really should be about empowering teachers with the knowledge and skills. We have some great screening requirements now across many states, as you saw. We have a lot of intervention requirements now through a lot of states, as you saw. We do not have a lot of effort to require that our teachers who are still in college, pre-service teachers, are getting the training that they need, or that our teachers who have been out working with our kids for years, our in-service teachers, that they're not getting the training that they need. So our advocacy efforts collectively really need to be directed in that area. So I have a lot of people to thank for being able to talk to you today about this topic. I'm super thankful to the Reading League Florida, Jesse Stife, is our president and has just been instrumental in getting our group together, getting our Facebook page put together on our website, and Kristen Kohler, who was so helpful in getting the word out about today's webinar. So I do want to quickly say the Reading League Florida website, my handout and this recording will be available on the Reading League Florida website. I did also around 3:30 today post just a Google Doc PDF of this handout to the Reading League Florida Facebook page. So if you go there, give us a like, and then you can download the handout from there as well. But it will also be available on the website eventually. It's not there quite yet, but in the meantime, if you want it, it's there. And if you scroll down, so you have these slides, but on that PDF, if you scroll all the way down to the very end of the document, I put a Word document in there with clickable links, because I know sometimes they're not clickable on a PDF PowerPoint. If you scroll to the end, all the links there are clickable. So everything I showed you, all the clickable links are there, and plus a lot of links that I didn't show you. I'm thankful to my friends at Decoding Dyslexia, both in Florida, Sue Sasko and Joy Probst, and then in Massachusetts, Nancy Duggan, who helped me think through some things yesterday in a panic text message exchange, making sure that I was up to date on all the information I wanted to share with you today. Judy Cohen is the president of our International Dyslexia Association in Florida. She and I got an opportunity to present this summer, and I learned so much from presenting with her, particularly about structured literacy, and that was reflected in tonight's slides. My colleagues at FSU and the Florida Center for Reading Research, and my academic mama, Dr. Tiffany Hogan. So I'm thankful for your time. I want to spend about 10 minutes answering some questions, and hope that in the meantime, you'll also follow along to learn more about the work that we're doing in the class lab at Florida State on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. The next few slides are just some resources I'm not going to go over, but you'll have access to all of these with lots of links and resources. So Jesse, if we want to maybe open up to some questions, I'm curious to hear what folks are saying.
Yeah, thank you. First, thank you so much. That was excellent. We really appreciate your time. Yeah, so we got a number of questions, and probably not enough time to answer all of them. So my true and deep apologies to those of you who you don't get a chance to get your questions. We're trying to figure out how to save the Q&A and get to them in follow-ups at least. We're going to start from the top, going back to the language portion of your presentation. Would you say that many students on the autism spectrum would also have dyslexia, or talk maybe a little bit about the co-occurrence between the two? Yeah,
it's possible. It's possible for autism and dyslexia to co-occur because autism tends to present as some difficulty with the pragmatic aspect of language or the social use of language. And so there can be certainly some difficulties with comprehension related to that, because it can be difficult sometimes to make inferences or do some predictions or understand sarcastic language within reading as a result of a diagnosis of autism. As far as the overlap between autism and dyslexia, I'll just be honest that I don't study autism, so I don't know much about the co-occurrence of the two of those things, but I know that there can be some comprehension difficulties related to pragmatics.
Thank you so much. This one, the quick one was, is there any distinction between developmental language disorder and oral language disorder? Oh,
great question. Well, basically it means the same thing. So for our purposes, it means the same thing. So what happened is that there were a lot of different terms that were used to refer to a language impairment. So specific language impairment, language disorder, oral language disorder, expressive language disorder, receptive language disorder, just all kinds of terminology. And so a group of child language researchers got together in, I think 2016 or 17, the Catalyst Consortium, and decided on one term that we're going to use as child language researchers and clinicians, and that term is developmental language disorder. So yes, those terms do mean the same thing. Developmental language disorder is kind of the updated and universal term to refer to children who have something like an oral language disorder that would kind of be subsumed under that. So yes, those are synonymous.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm going to skip down a couple. So there's a question about rhyme, and rhyme being often difficult for children with phonological difficulties. Yeah. The question is about how worthwhile it is to focus on rhyming and other sort of early phonological skills, or working at the phoneme level, primarily segmenting and blending. I see you smiling because I can see where I'm going with this.
Yep.
To support reading and spelling. Lots of teachers that this person works with will often feel that this skill is a prerequisite before moving on to the phoneme level.
Yeah, great question. And I've heard this a lot. So it's not a prerequisite. It is not, rhyming is not a prerequisite skill. So that spectrum that I showed you isn't really a hierarchy or progression through skills. I mean, when you think linguistically about what you're asking kids to do, it should be linguistically easier to rhyme and to think about whole units of language like words than it should be to delete or segment, parse apart these teeny little units of language. But that's not always the case. And so my recommendation is typically, don't give up on rhyming, but don't get stuck on rhyming. So if there are other skills that you can build in the meantime, please go forth and build. So if they can work on phonemic awareness or phonics, other skills that are more complex linguistically, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean that they're more complex for that child. They might have an easier time learning that. And then because there's this reciprocal nature with phonological awareness and with word reading, there's also this kind of tiny little reciprocal nature of phonological awareness in and of itself. So it's a possibility that if we work on more challenging skills, linguistically challenging skills like phoneme deletion or phoneme manipulation, that those rhyming skills can come with time. It is not a prerequisite, so it's not really a hierarchy or progression per se, and that's going to kind of be on an individual basis. But you do not need to get stuck on rhyming in order to move forward. I would move forward and see what they can do, and if they do well on linguistically more complex tasks, then you can maybe continue to revisit rhyming and see if at some point that kind of clicks.
Excellent, thank you. There's a number of folks in the Q&A saying, yes, a 2.0 would be great. They want some more information about specifics about assessment and diagnosis. I think I might be able to speak a little bit to particular test instruments that teachers can administer versus those that where you need a little bit more training in norm referenced assessment administration. So a lot of the ones on the slides that you had noted on there, the test of word reading efficiency, the Woodcock-Johnson tests of achievement. These are all generally tests that school psychologists, speech language pathologists, master's level teachers with some graduate training in assessment and measurement will be able to administer. The general classification B, they're called, academic achievement assessments, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other assessments that you can do, curriculum-based assessments for teachers in the classroom. We had mentioned, we talked a lot about, or I think you had mentioned screeners like Dibbles has some great assessments, oral reading fluency assessments with fantastic normative information and benchmarks that have high levels of predictive validity. Acadience is another publisher of curriculum-based measurements, oral reading fluency, nonsense word reading fluency, phoneme segmentation fluency in kindergarten and first grade. We don't have any sort of financial relationship with the folks at CORE, but there's a book called CORE Assessing Reading Multiple Measures that contain curriculum-based decoding surveys. They're not norm referenced; they're criterion referenced, and where they have decoding phonics surveys, phoneme deletion tests, oral reading fluency assessments, vocabulary screenings. That's another great resource. There are other sort of free available download ones. Some of them include from the Really Great Reading Company. They have a series of diagnostic decoding surveys. There's a basic, an advanced, and an advanced plus. That's one that you tend to see around, and that's it's an excellent curriculum-based criterion referenced assessment. None of these are assessments that will tell you definitively whether or not a student has dyslexia. They are assessments of diagnostic assessments of underlying skills that tend to correlate with dyslexia. There were a couple of questions about formal diagnosis of dyslexia, and boy, boy, that's a can of worms,
Sure is.
you know, in and of itself. But you know, that you can say a lot about. But in general, I think Nancy Duggan had put in a comment, had asked a question or put in a comment about IDEA and specific learning disabilities. Dyslexia is in IDEA is one of these specific learning disabilities. Dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, these are all under the umbrella of SLD. And if you are a public school teacher, many students have individual education plans under the classification of specific learning disabilities. Dyslexia is one of the specific learning disabilities. You'll find many folks who will argue convincingly that dyslexia and specific learning disabilities in basic reading skills are largely synonymous. You can make a good case for that. But then schools generally tend to lack understanding about what dyslexia is and don't necessarily make the connection between the two, let alone evidence-based, research-based best practices and instruction for children with specific learning disabilities and basic reading skills or dyslexia. So that's just my piece. I am a school psychologist, so that's that is a topic and a dyslexia advocate. So that is a topic that is near and dear to my heart.
I think, Jesse, I would like to put my vote in for you doing a Dyslexia 2.0 all about assessment. I think that would be excellent. And I'd be happy to share about some measures that speech and language pathologists are qualified to administer and can administer. And I would love to hear more about some of the measures that you mentioned and that you'd recommend for classroom teachers. So I think that's my vote for the 2.0.
Well, you can right now, actually, since you now that you mention it. I did do about an hour and a half webinar for the International Dyslexia Association Florida chapter on dyslexia assessment, and where we touch on on what constructs to assess, what types of tools a school psychologist or speech pathologist may be able to do versus a teacher, what the difference is between a private evaluation versus a public school evaluation. You can find all of these things on the YouTube channel of the International Dyslexia Association Florida chapter. I did that with my colleague, Dr. Colleen Kroons, who's also on the board of directors there with me. So thank you for that. Thank you for setting me up for that plug. If we had, let's maybe one or two more questions.
Sure.
Let's see here. Oh my gosh, 33 new things came up. I haven't even I wasn't able to take a look. There were a couple of questions about curriculum specific things. Orton Gillingham, Wilson, Erla reading program. We were trying to stay pretty curriculum agnostic about this. So we can certainly discuss curricula and instructional components in a follow-up for sure.
Yeah. And I think the important part is that a lot of those are structured literacy. They would be categorized as structured literacy. So without naming them, you can still look to see, are they explicit? Are they diagnostic? Do they use the term structured literacy instead of balanced literacy? To make, that's one way that you can kind of check that. But again, none of those programs are robust or evidence-based if the teachers aren't trained in how to use them. So just saying that you're going to buy Wilson Foundations and not training anyone on how to use it does not help anybody. So we do have to make sure our teachers are empowered.
Great. Let's see here. Just trying to scroll really quick while honoring your time and honoring everyone else's time. There was a question about hearing impairments and dyslexia. Can a hearing impairment co-occur with dyslexia? Can hearing impairments cause or lead to phonological difficulties that then lead to word reading difficulties?
So yes to both, that dyslexia can co-occur with a hearing impairment. So someone can have a hearing impairment and have dyslexia. Someone can also have a hearing impairment and not necessarily have dyslexia, which is neurobiological. And, you could be able to determine that through some fMRIs or ERPs, the way that the brain responds to phonological information. But it could be the case that a person with a hearing loss, depending on the severity and the frequency level, does have difficulty processing phonological information, because a lot of our speech sounds are high frequency speech sounds, as far as not high frequency of occurrence, but high frequency of spectral analysis. They're high frequency and can be difficult to hear. So like s or sh can be difficult to hear depending on the degree of hearing loss. So that can result over time in difficulties with phonology. And certainly can have downstream effects for word reading difficulty and spelling difficulty. But again, early intervention is going to be key here. And, kind of discussing the family's options as far as access to spoken language, to make sure that we're, giving a child the opportunity to hear phonology if that is anatomically and physically possible and in alignment with what the family chooses to do. So if the family does choose to get something like cochlear implants or a bone anchored hearing aid or hearing aids in general, that can really improve a child's access to spoken language. But there still does need to be a lot of oral rehab to make sure that they learn how to hear, they learn how to listen. And so it's not just kind of giving them hearing aids and then assuming that they can learn phonology without really being explicitly taught. So there's a lot of early intervention that needs to happen with hearing loss. But yes, they can co-occur. But it can also be the case that it's not dyslexia, it's just the absence of access to phonology, to the phonological system of any language, that can result in those same very similar looking difficulties. Yeah.
Right. That was excellent. So a couple of last things. There were a couple of folks who mentioned October is Dyslexia Awareness Month.
It is.
So the Reading League Florida will be having a Dyslexia Resource Share-a-Palooza. Keep on a lookout for that, where we're starting a resource kind of compendium of articles and webinars and other resources relating to dyslexia assessment, instruction, identification,
Great.
All sorts of excellent things. There are a number of questions about interventions. So about a database of interventions. The things that come to mind are things like the What Works Clearinghouse or Evidence for ESSA, which, I mean, you will find many varying opinions about something like the What Works Clearinghouse. They are not perfect by any means. You will find intervention programs in the What Works Clearinghouse that are very effective. You will find other interventions that have been well studied, but according to many, not very well validated, particularly for children with dyslexia. So certainly buyer beware there and we want to have a critical eye for research when looking at things like the What Works Clearinghouse. I find other resource databases like the National Center on Intensive Intervention, the NCII, they have something similar for screeners, and reading and math screeners and reading and math interventions. That's another resource to look at. I have my personal opinion in terms of books. I found a book written by Dr. David Kilpatrick called Essentials of Assessing, Preventing, and Overcoming Reading Difficulties to be very, very helpful. Yeah. So in that book, he pours over quite a bit of the experimental research and discusses several interventions that have been shown to be very effective for children with dyslexia with good training, and when implemented with fidelity and under the right circumstances. Programs like Linda Moubel Lips and phonographics. Those are just two examples of programs that appear in that book that have strong evidence bases to them.
Yeah, and I love that book as well. It's a great recommendation.
Absolutely. Okay, so I want to be mindful of your time here. It's 5:40. We are 10 minutes over. So We have heard everyone's calls for Dyslexia 2.0. I encourage everyone to take a look out for IDA Florida's webinar for dyslexia assessment, and we will certainly are looking to schedule our webinars in 2022, and that will be very much at the top of the list. So thank you for everyone for attending. Thank you, Kelly, for all of this wonderful information, and we hope that you have a wonderful evening and a wonderful fall with your students. Everyone, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jesse. Thank you all for coming.